My name's Mark. I work for a little security consultancy that I own called Torrin. I've worked for some of the larger security consultancies in the UK as well, and I see a number of my peers in the room. What I've been asked to do is give the security consultant's perspective on planning and design of buildings. Now, to give you that perspective, I'll give you a little bit of history on myself. I'll talk a little bit about typical sort of security consultant deployments, some of the ways that planning brings us in to the building design process, and some of the things that we see along the way, and I'll leave you hopefully with some thoughts that we can take into the planning process. Now, I do see probably at least half the room are security specialists, so this is really for the benefit of the other half. For the planners, architects, designers amongst us, a security design consultant, it isn't a protected term. A security consultant isn't defined. So it covers everything from somebody who does your threat assessment, which might be property specific, it might be a thesis on the history of Sunni and Shia relations in the Middle East, through to somebody who does the detailed coordination of locks and access control readers onto doors and everything in between. It might even mean somebody who provides armed support in hostile environments might also call themselves a security consultant. So I tend to use, for these purposes, when we're talking about the built environment and property, the term security design consultant. And for me, I feel obliged to try and make eye contact with the previous speaker at this point. Thank you very much for putting security consultants down as a stakeholder in your nice circular slide there. Because what I see as our job is, if this will skip forward, there we go. I think most of the time it feels like we're sat between Bjarke Ingels on the right and Cressida on the left, where Bjarke is one of the celebrity architects around at the minute. I've got to be a little bit careful because I know there are some people in the room who are working on projects that he's designing. I'm picking on Bjarke because he thinks architecture should try to make the world a bit more like our dreams. And I'm picking on Cressida because I could find a nice picture of her looking suitably frustrated with concepts like that. So what we do, obviously, there should be a couple of other people in that picture. There should be the property developer, and Nick gave a nice demonstration earlier of how that can work very positively for security when the owner and the developer see security benefits, or their tenants see security benefits. And then obviously the planners should be the other part of that story. And clearly it's an oversimplification because I don't sit in a room with Bjarke and Cressida on a daily basis. I sit in a room with teams of architects who work for Bjarke and CTSAs and design and crime officers who work for the police. What we do is sit in the middle because projects need either the risk and strategy or the detailed security design to implement the CTSA's recommendations a lot of the time. Now, I mentioned that security design isn't a protected term. What I'd like, the two things really that I'd like planners and architects to take away from today is that security design is a career. I think when I stumbled out of my comprehensive school in the northeast of England in the 90s, there was a careers advisor who told you to either do a manual job or become a post office clerk, and there wasn't a route to a career in security. There are now security-related degrees with a lot of prominent universities. There are membership groups, some of which I've listed there, which all take a slightly different slant on things, but all of which give you some sort of comfort that the security design consultant that might help your built environment project has a level of competence and professional integrity. So ASIS, the Security Institute, of which I'm a member, the Association of Security Consultants, the RSES is the membership body run by CPNI, the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, which was previously mentioned. And they all take a slightly different approach to things. I've also included there the SABRE registered professional badge as a nod to BRE. So BRE, as Gavin mentioned, have launched SABRE, which is their security assessment scheme. Within that, they're badging security professionals, and they're taking a slightly different approach where they're badging people according to their specialism. So just because I can do a threat assessment doesn't mean that I'm the best person to do the electrical coordination for your cameras. And they're picking up that sort of level of detail in their badging, which I think is a good thing for the integrity of the industry. Picking out two of those bodies in terms of what sort of criteria there might be to be a security design consultant. The theme that seems to be emerging looking at the Security Institute and the SABRE registered professional badges in particular, is 3 years experience and a degree, which I think is a good thing to aim for and gives us a little bit of credibility. What I'd like, again, another thing I'd like us to take away is obviously the planners will know this and the architects will know this if there are any in the room. Every specialist designer wants to be employed earlier on projects. They want to be employed on more projects. They want more glory and higher fees. And I would ask the same for security consultants, essentially. But what we should be doing is getting involved, certainly at concept design stage, helping to define the strategy, to meet early with the planners and discuss security threats and risks and how we might mitigate those. And then to take that through develop design, technical design, and into construction and operation. And quite how we do that depends on your procurement route. It depends on the preferred activities of the different security consultancy and where their specialisms lie. But the earlier the better. Now, in terms of how we interface with planning, I think Nick gave a nice overview from the Canary Wharf perspective of how things work on one half of the sort of security design appointments that we pick up, which is where the developer or the tenants recognise that there are benefits to security, and they appoint a security design consultant without any outside impetus. They realise that certain types of tenants or regulated tenants or the location or the nature of their business justifies some serious consideration for security, but that's not the case for everything. And planning has led to security design appointments in a number of ways that I don't know are immediately obvious, even necessarily to the planners. So I just wanted to have a quick run through them and maybe set up some discussion for after lunch. So going back a few years, there was a thing called the Code for Sustainable Homes. That was conditioned onto a number of residential developments, and it required those residential developments to achieve part certification with Section 2 of Secured by Design. So what that effectively meant was architects and residential developers who up until that point had been complying with the principles of Secured by Design suddenly had to actually think about how they were going to build past 24 doors and reasonably secure windows into their developments. And that led to security consultants being appointed to help the architect figure out how to meet that requirement, which I would argue led, probably not in the intended fashion, into a better and more secure residential product. A similar story happened with BREEAM, which we have to mention as we're at BRE. The BREEAM sustainability standard is often conditioned on the buildings, and one of the ways that those buildings can achieve a point is by carrying out a security needs assessment. And probably that's where SABRE developed from. It had a similar set of criteria for who could carry out that assessment. Some experience and qualifications were needed. And it indirectly, because people wanted to point towards their conditioned BREEAM rating, it brought some security consultancy into buildings that might not necessarily have had it. And obviously I would argue that that led to a better and more secure product. And then finally we get either specific conditions, or we get the condition where the developer or the architect is obliged to speak to the police, design and out crime officer, counter-terrorism security advisor, crime prevention design advisor. And sometimes those projects resolve themselves, and the architect and the engineers can deal with the recommendations that come from the police. And sometimes they need a bit of help, and that might be the detailed design of blast mitigation or hostile vehicle mitigation measures to meet the requirements set out by the police. It might be a little bit of help with the strategy of how they're going to meet those requirements and everything in between. But those tend to be the ways in which we interface with planning. We help developers to demonstrate that they've met not just security-related planning requirements, but environmental and general residential as well. I think this is probably going to be a big part of the discussion after lunch, is what does good security look like? And proportionality was a term that kept appearing in various presentations through the morning. And it's an interesting question for me. I think I've put up, if we look there, I've put up a slide of some turnstiles, because that is, it's a fairly mundane, run-of-the-mill example of a security measure. It's something that if I'm talking to the police design and a crime officer on behalf of a commercial developer, the design and crime officer usually wants some sort of segregation to keep people out of the body of the building to deter walk-in thefts. The developer might not want to spend the money on turnstiles, might want some sort of open lobby arrangement. So we end up in a discussion between a commercial imperative, an aesthetic imperative — architects never like turnstiles in my experience — and a security imperative where we should really be trying to deter walk-in thefts from commercial office buildings. And who's right? And I think there's an argument that the person spending the money might be the person who makes the decision. There's an argument that the planner might be the person who makes the decision. Maybe the police should make the decision. It's a challenge, and it's one I look forward to discussing after lunch. I think there are any number of other examples of that we could discuss on residential, secured by design, and the design and out crime officers increasingly ask for segregation of residential developments between floors. So if I've got more than X number of apartments on a floor, I should segregate via control of the lifts or via doors on the landing access to floors. Now, whether for commercial reasons, because they haven't got those extra 20 doors in the budget, or for more generously wanting to build communities within their building, architects and developers often don't want to do that. And I think it's an interesting question. If they don't see a market value in the secured by design badge, they may or may not. But if they don't, then who gets to decide whether they should or shouldn't build those doors in, and whether community is more, and the ability to pop downstairs to borrow a cup of sugar is more important than denying somebody the ability to move throughout the building and do as they would. How do I get this under there? Can I do this with a keyboard, guys? Yeah. And then finally, mostly because I wanted to get my picture of Groot in there, and because we're at BRE and I've talked about BREEAM, I think a couple of people have alluded to this, but I want to bring sustainability of buildings and well-being of people into the security discussion. And I'd like to think that we can do a bit better in terms of thinking about that more in the round and holistically, which is the word you were trying not to use earlier on. BRE have recognised that security's got a role to play in sustainability by including the security needs assessment in the BREEAM scheme. I think it's kind of obvious that to take the most basic definition, a sustainable development is one that doesn't suffer adversely and frequently from crime and terrorism. I think there are academic papers available that will give you a carbon cost of crime if you want to take it down to that level, because we have to send police resources to deal with it, and we have to keep the lights on in prison, and we can take that approach. And I think it was interesting, again, to hear Nick talking about the corporate tenants asking questions about safety and security and within buildings and around the Wharf development about how their staff are being kept safe. And I think there's a well-being aspect to keeping people safe and having people know that they're being kept safe in a way that isn't too intrusive, that maybe we can do a bit better with in terms of planning. So I've cantered through that very quickly, guys, so that I don't get too much into your lunch break. Those are my details. I'll be around for the panel discussions and the rest of the day if anybody's got any questions, and especially if my peer security consultants in the room want to contradict me on anything, please pull me up in the questions and answers later. Thank you.